Jim Bridger, Part 4. In a storeroom of the fort was a considerable stock of buffalo robes, one of which I purchased for the sum of $5. It was an exceptionally large, fine robe with long, silky hair, and its equal I have rarely seen. It was, moreover, greatly needed, as I had suffered much from exposure when sleeping on cold and often wet ground. Other storerooms were nearly bare of goods. In one was a keg of whiskey, a jar of tobacco, a box of clay pipes, and but little else. I should mention, however, some large pipes made of a red stone called St. Peter's rock, said to have been brought from the upper Mississippi and highly esteemed by the Indians. The price at which they are sold to $5 would indicate that they are considered valuable, while Mr. Bridger informed me that there is a very ready sale for them. They are not even bored out, but simply shaped as pipe bowls are, and thus sold. A famous character living at Fort Bridger was one Judge Carter, the sutler of the fort. He is reputed to have been a man of much education, great wealth, and unbounded hospitality. One other feature of the judge seems to have made a hit with the wayfarer, and that was his discriminating taste in the selection of wines and cigars. When Bridger and the judge would get together for a congenial glass, the former was wont to remark that he never in all his life and varied fortunes saw any bad whiskey. Excuse me. It was all good. True, some brands were better than others, but it was all good. There never was any bad whiskey. But Bridger had his troubles in spite of the excellent location of his trading post. The Mormons had a grievance against him in 1856 and made threats against his life, confiscating all his stock of merchandise and everything else of any value. They destroyed the buildings of the fort by fire, Bridger barely escaping with his life. His loss, he alleged, was $100,000. The Utah expedition under General Albert Sidney Johnston was the outcome of this affair, Bridger acting as guide to the expedition. Upon arriving at the spot where the fort had stood, Johnston was tendered the use of the site by Bridger, and the army wintered there. This was the time, as mentioned elsewhere, that the government purchased from the frontiersman his Mexican grant of the property, but never paid a cent for it, alleging that he did not have a clear title to the land. This was but one of the many injustices done Jim Bridger. After building up this little oasis in the desert and seeing it made the rendezvous year after year of trappers, Indians, and immigrants, and establishing a post that had been of inestimable value to the government, it was a serious loss to the frontiersman to be thus deprived of his little possessions. Bridger's experience with Sir George Gore, the wealthy Irish nobleman who came to America in 1854 for a grand hunt in the Rocky Mountains, is rich in the dry humor of which the famous plainsman was noted. It is not likely that another such caravan as Sir George's ever invaded the Rockies before or since. His retinue consisted of 40 men supplied with 112 horses, 12 yoke of oxen, 14 dogs, 6 wagons, and 21 carts. Sir George arrived at St. Louis, where he outfitted and proceeded across the plains to Fort Laramie. Here, the caravan halted and spent the winter. Sir George appears to have been a very democratic sort of person, notwithstanding his English title. He had heard of the value of Bridger as a guide and succeeded in inducing him to accompany his party in that capacity. During the winter at Fort Laramie, Sir George devoted a good share of his time in studying the wild, motley crowd with which he was associated, and became deeply interested in the noted hunters, trappers, and Indian chiefs who made the fort their headquarters and rendezvous. Excuse me. With the coming of spring, Sir George's caravan with Bridger in the van started for the headwaters of the Powder River, thence turning up the Yellowstone to the mouth of Tongue River. Greatly delighted with the beauty of the scenery and the wild, free life he was leading, Sir George here erected a fort where he and a goodly number of his outfit spent the winter of 1855. Sir George found in Bridger a most agreeable and desirable companion, and Bridger himself was equally impressed with the Irish nobleman. It is related that Sir George would tarry in bed until about 10 o'clock, then arise, take a bath, and go on a hunt. sometimes staying out as late as 10 o'clock at night, but would always insist upon having supper served and Bridger seated with him. After the meal, Sir George would read aloud to his guide from Shakespeare and endeavor to draw out his ideas of the author. Bridger did not seem impressed with Falstaff, declaring it was too highfalutin for him, and that air fool stuff was too fond of lager beer. To the tales of Baron Munchausen, he only shook his head, remarking, "I'll be doggoned if I can swaller anything that 'ere Baron says, derned if I don't believe he's a liar." He further commented on them by remarking that some of his own adventures among the Blackfeet would read just as wonderful if writ down in a book. One evening, Sir George entertained Bridger by reading to him Sir Walter Scott's account of the Battle of Waterloo, and asked him if he did not regard that as the most sanguinary battle he had ever heard of, to which Bridger replied, "Wall now, Mr. Gore, that there must have been considerable of a skirmish, doggone my skin if it mustn't. Them 'ere Britishers must have fit better than they did down to New Orleans, where old Hickory gin 'em the forkedest sort of chain lightning that perhaps you never did see in all your born days." And upon Sir George expressing a little incredulity in regard to the estimation Bridger placed upon the battle, the latter added, "You can just go your pile on it, Mr. Gore. You can as sure as you're born." In the spring of 1855, the Gore party left the fort on the Tongue and ascended the river, meeting with a large party of Crow Indians, where several days were pleasantly spent in their village. Later, the party returned to the mouth of the Tongue, where Sir George had a couple of flatboats built, and he, with sufficient men to handle the boats, floated down the Yellowstone to Fort Union, first sending his wagons and other paraphernalia to Fort Union overland with the rest of his command. It is not likely that Bridger accompanied Sir George, as he was back at Fort Bridger in '56, when his troubles with the Mormons occurred. When Sir George arrived at Fort Union, he concluded to continue down the Missouri River by boat and made an agreement with the commander of the fort for the construction of the boats. But when they were completed, a wordy war ensued regarding the terms of the deal. The commander, Major Culbertson, had agreed to take Sir George's wagons and outfit, but they could arrive at no decision, which so aroused the wrath of Sir George that he piled all his stock in a huge heap in front of the fort and burned it, even going so far as to guard the fires until the property was all destroyed, and then raking the ashes over to recover the ironwork and tires of the wagons, which he threw into the Missouri, determined that nobody at the fort should enrich themselves a penny at his expense. He then either sold or gave away to vagabond hangers-on among the Indians his cattle and horses, and he and his party continued on down the river in the same two flatboats in which they had arrived at the fort. At Fort Berthold, the party wintered with an Indian chief. Here Sir George became a great favorite, but such a slaughter did he and his men make among the buffalo herds during the winter of 1855-56 that the attention of the United States government was drawn thereto, and steps were taken to prevent any further annihilation by the Gore party. Sir George returned to civilization in St. Louis by steamboat in the spring of 1857. End of part 4.